On this episode of China Unscripted, the Olympics. It's like China isn't even trying. Why Bloomberg loves China's zero COVID policy, and Olympic darling Eileen Gu. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley John.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
And today we got to talk about the joy of the Olympics, don't you think? Aren't you guys filled with Olympic fervor?
The spirit of the Olympics.
Oh, yeah.
That's one way to put it.
Oh, yeah. I think the best way to start off this talking about the Olympics is I got to show this video that I posted of a Chinese soldier saluting the Olympic flag. So let's roll that. I love that guy's dedication to it. Like, it goes wrong, and he keeps plowing ahead. That's really a metaphor for the Olympics, don't you think?
The Olympics? Well, I mean, if he didn't do that, he would definitely get in trouble.
I mean, I'm sure he's got in trouble
anyway.
Regardless, yeah.
Yeah, well, see, I think what's interesting about the video is that all three of the soldiers just keep going, and they have no humor about it, right? Like, it's dead serious. They can't recognize the mistake.
Well, that's not, I mean, it's a flag raising thing. If you ever watch any flag raising ceremony, the people don't look like they have a sense of humor, no matter what country it is.
I think that's what's wrong with flag raising.
Okay.
We need more comedy in flag raising. Let's get that.
Two flags walk into a bar.
I once knew a flag from Nantucket.
Okay, moving on.
And we're still classier than the Olympics.
You know what was interesting is I saw Christopher Balding posted a tweet talking about the Olympics and how, his wife was talking about watching the Olympics and going, I lived in China for 7 years. I know when, they're trying to put on a good show. And she's like, they're not trying. They're bringing their D game here.
And that's a good point. Like, why do you think that is? Do you think they just don't need to anymore?
Well, I mean, I think that some of the pomp and circumstance they would normally have around it is definitely affected by COVID, right? Like,
yeah,
the fact that you've made everybody come into this bubble and like everybody around you, like the video that you posted of the guy, making a martini for somebody.
The quarantini.
The quarantini. That was good.
Thank you.
But yeah, like here he is bartending in a full PPE suit. How festive could that be?
That's right. Hey, how do you use the restroom when you're wearing one of those? Is that why it's called a PPE? And we're still classier than the Olympics.
I would imagine that it's much easier for guys.
I mean,
I don't want to get into that.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking about the slope that they put in an industrial park.
Well, a former industrial park.
A former industrial park. Actually, our video editor, Seamus, made the good point that, like, why cut down a pristine forest for these horrible games when, like, it belongs in a former industrial park. This is where the Olympics belong. What
I love about that is, when we were concepting this Olympic t-shirt that we made about, fake snow, real genocide.
Which you can get at ChinaUncensored.tv/merchandise. Link is below.
Okay, good, Chris.
Thank you.
Like, we could never have come up with this image.
Yeah.
It didn't occur to us at all to, like, put this giant, like, ski slope right in the middle of what looked like nuclear cooling tower. It's
smokestacks.
Yeah, it's not nuclear. It's like a former steel mill. But the whole thing, it just looks so terrible.
That's what I've always found in, like, all of these years covering the Chinese Communist Party. Like, in a way, it is beyond parody because they do things that are just I could never come up with. This is just a good example.
It's not beyond parody, Chris. I mean, what have you been doing for 9.5 years?
Struggling to meet reality.
That's like when it's like it looks like it's something that belongs in The Onion.
Oh, yeah.
But it's not The Onion.
Or updated for modern times, Babylon Bee.
Yeah, both. I mean, to be fair to the industrial park, it is something that they are, they're supposedly kind of claiming it and turning it into a park with tourist attractions and whatever. So they're not the first one to do that. I think it's just and that ski slope will be there forever.
It's just that right now it's so brown and gray.
But I mean, you remember what the High Line looked like in New York City, right? Like the High Line Park was built on this old railway.
Yeah.
And it was
I'm sure it looks better in the summer.
Yeah.
No, not. I'm thinking because the High Line looks great in the summer, but not as great in the winter.
I don't think I've been there in the winter.
But, speaking of like the sort of being beyond parody, there was that Russian athlete who started posting photos of the meals she was given in quarantine. And they fed her this for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 5 days. And like, imagine being like a high-performing athlete that needs to be on point with everything. And this is what they're feeding you.
Yeah, so I don't think the Chinese Communist Party really appreciated that one or all of the stories about how terrible the food was for the quarantine athletes, because then the Global Times came up with this article about how great the food is at the Olympics and what, people's favorite dishes are in the Olympic Village.
A banquet of delicacies.
Yeah, and it's just hilarious because there's a joke about how you don't know that something is true in China until the Communist Party denies it.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's just kind of like they're so upset about like any tiny little thing that makes it look bad that they're like, okay, no, we have to make an article about how everybody loves the food.
Well, it's weird because, as you said, it's like they're bringing their D game to this, but they're still kind of like concerned about the public perception of the Olympic Games.
Yeah. Well, to your point, Shelley, about it's, you don't know what's true until they deny it. There was some Chinese foreign ministry saying that they would never manipulate COVID test results.
Oh, because people were a little concerned that athletes might be disqualified for having positive COVID tests,
right,
and that might not be the case.
Yeah. Well, there's also the test of like when they accuse somebody else of doing what they're actually doing. Like, remember how they said like the U.S. would be trying to manipulate the games, throw the results. And then there's all this talk of like Chinese judges being super biased. There's that one video of the Chinese skating athlete kind of like shoving, I forget who he was shoving, but another country's player. And it's just, obviously these games are like highly rigged, especially if they're, putting foreign athletes into horrible quarantines where they're not being fed. They don't have access to training equipment. There's loads of reports of no internet or little internet.
Oh, that's those athletes' fault for, coming down with COVID.
That's right. Hey, whose fault is it that COVID spread around the world in the first place?
No, Chris. China is a victim.
I was going to say, yeah, because Canada came from Canadian mail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely that. It's kind of like the whole trade deal with the U.S., how they didn't meet they didn't even meet it
was like 60%.
Less than 60% of their targets of buying U.S. exports to China.
It's not so much a target as it is a promise.
That they didn't keep. Well, they were like, well, it's not our fault. It was the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And, who could have done anything about that?
Yeah.
Who could have / should have known in January 2020 when China's trade representative signed the deal that there was a deadly virus? Oh, wait, China already knew exactly what was happening inside China.
Yeah, I mean, I will give them December. I believe that most of December, the Wuhan officials were trying to keep it under wraps because they were going to get in trouble. But by January, there's definitely evidence that Xi Jinping knew very early on what was going on.
Like it went from a local government cover-up to a central government cover-up.
Yep. Until the point when they couldn't do it anymore. But that didn't matter because then they had the WHO in their pocket.
Yeah. Oh, and also, I found this out recently. Before the pandemic began, the scientific consensus was that lockdowns and quarantines don't work. They're a bad idea. You shouldn't do them. But then China pushed the message that we've handled COVID so well and we did lockdowns. You guys, everyone should do it. And that got kind of echoed down the line, in particular by Imperial College London. A study by Neil Ferguson, who has been wrong about previous epidemic diseases like swine flu and whatnot. He came up with what data scientists admit is like a horribly buggy, screwed up modeling system that predicted
20 million deaths or something. It was really that was the most extreme thing that scared a lot of governments. Right?
Yeah. And it was wildly wrong. And it turns out Imperial College London is getting a lot of money from China.
I mean, we don't know that is why they would have done
no,
this.
we can't connect the dots. There are just these dots that are right there.
The problem is that everybody is getting money from China.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So it's not.
I mean, Harvard too.
Yeah. So it's not like we can definitely say that Imperial London College London had a faulty, had a faulty computer model because of Chinese funding, but
they just had a faulty computer model, period.
And have Chinese funding.
Yeah, those are two unrelated statements. But I think that's one of the things that, we do a lot of studies, the whole modern scientific, way of doing things. You do these studies. But the problem with these complex computer models is the quality of your results are dependent on a large number of assumptions you make, all being totally correct, right? And you can never get all your assumptions correct. And so this is just a problem with modeling in general. And any data scientist or anyone who does modeling knows this, right? Like it's just hard to get all the inputs right. But the weird thing is that you put a dozen or 24 different inputs in, and you get one input out, which is like the number of projected deaths in this case. And people believe that without questioning how the model was set up. So, why weren't there questions about that? Why weren't there questions about how the model was created? Not just what does the model say?
Because we're busy panicking in the middle of an unknown disease spreading around the world.
That's a good point. No, you're right. We should have been busy panicking, and we were.
I mean, I'm just saying that's kind of what happened, I think.
Yeah.
That governments were under a lot of pressure to do something.
Yeah, and we were hoarding toilet paper and spraying down our groceries.
The spraying down the groceries was later. I don't think we had even started hoarding toilet paper yet.
Well, I guess this depends on when we're talking about.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think this was February of 2020.
Do something.
Yeah. I remember having conversations with people about hey, at the beginning, hey, I think I've heard about this disease coming from China. And just the progression of it's probably, not going to be that bad, just to, it might be kind of bad. We might be heading for something not so great.
Other people, or you talking to people?
I remember talking to people about that. Because I'm a relentless optimist.
I definitely remember talking with people I was working with at the time and being like, okay, well, I think we're going to be out probably a little longer than 2 weeks.
Hey, aren't we almost to the 2-year anniversary of 2 weeks to slow the spread?
Yeah, 15 days to slow the spread. But it's,
flatten
1,500,
the curve,
2 weeks to slow the spread, 15 days to flatten the curve. And, 700 days later, we're doing okay. We're not doing okay.
It's good you can admit that.
Yeah.
But hey, let's get back to the Olympics. I think the other interesting controversy that's come out of the Olympics is sort of the idea of these American-born athletes competing for China and the scrutiny they're getting.
Yeah, it's interesting because the conversation is very different depending on whether you're in America or China. Somebody was saying on Twitter that in America, the conversation becomes about race, essentially. Mm-hmm. And in China, the conversation is about class and privilege.
Explain that.
Well, because the person who's been the most under scrutiny is probably Eileen Gu, right? She's a Chinese-American skier who won the gold medal at the Big Air event, which was the one that was in the dystopian-looking industrial park. And, she had been competing for the USA in events, and then in 2019 decided to switch and compete for Team China instead. Shortly after going to Beijing and meeting Xi Jinping and being in a big photo op with a bunch of, Chinese future Olympic athletes.
Yeah,
right?
It's crazy that she was next to Xi Jinping, basically.
Yeah, so Eileen Gu, she's getting a lot of attention partly because she's at the top of her game. She's at the top of obviously winning a gold in the Olympics, but also she is biracial Chinese American and has, done things like called China her homeland and said how proud she was for, skiing for them. And there's talk about whether she had to give up her American citizenship to do it or not.
Yeah, because China does not recognize dual citizenship. And so what does it mean when American-born athletes are competing for China? Did they have to give up their citizenship? It's a question they're really trying hard not to answer.
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of being portrayed as, well, like, why are you in the U.S. There's some defensiveness from Asian Americans saying, like, are you giving people a loyalty test because they're Asian, right? Like, because we're not seen as real Americans, so now you're saying, like, we have to do something or other.
Well, because this is in the context of there are white Americans who are competing for China.
There are also Chinese Americans who are competing for America, like Nathan Chen, who won gold in the men's figure skating. He's Chinese American and won gold for America. So, like, there's...
Well, that seems different.
Well, I think because that's the more normal way to do it, right? In terms of, like, oh, well, you're Chinese American, you're competing for America.
Well, you're talking about an American citizen competing for America. That's not strange. But the issue that people were having on Twitter was that everyone's making a focus of Eileen Gu, who is Chinese American, but they're not talking so much about the, white Americans.
Actually, not on Twitter. That was a BuzzFeed article that brought this up. On Twitter, people were mostly talking about whether it's fair to make this 18-year-old Chinese American girl, like, the face of, having to answer for human rights atrocities in China and all this kind of stuff.
Well, I mean, she's under a lot of scrutiny also because, she's very beautiful. She even has like a Victoria's Secret contract coming up or something. And like, as somebody who is also often scrutinized for being beautiful, I can really relate to the pressures. It's hard.
She does. I mean, she has signed a lot of lucrative deals, modeling contracts. Somebody estimated that she probably has like $31 million worth of sponsorship deals.
Really? Victoria's Secret did not offer me that. Well, wait till you see the photo shoot. It's classy.
I can't talk anymore.
Yes.
But like, she has lived a very privileged life, right?
And so that's what you were saying about like the class versus race debate?
Yes. So to your point, in America, there are white Americans who are competing for the Chinese hockey team.
Mm-hmm.
And these are Americans who are already playing in China's hockey leagues, like China's version of the NHL. And it's not clear to me whether they had to give up their citizenship, but if I had to guess, I would say probably not.
Which is then the issue that, like, has the Chinese Communist Party made a special exemption for these Olympic athletes?
Yeah. There was another Chinese American athlete, Zhu Yi, who apparently did give up her citizenship, because a lot of media have been reporting that she's given up her American citizenship to compete for China. She's the one who fell twice in the figure skating competition.
And has been trashed on Chinese social media.
Yeah, there's a lot going on with that, because some people there were conspiracy theories about whether she got on the Chinese team taking a real Chinese person's spot, quote unquote, which is like, if you're successful, you're a real Chinese person. But if you fail,
there's a lot of xenophobia on the Chinese internet.
Yeah, but so there was some theories about whether she undeservedly got a spot because her father is a very prestigious scientist, I think. So, like, there were some stuff about that. And I think also, obviously, because she fell and brought the team China, they didn't win a medal in the figure skating, partly because of her. Yeah. Right? So there's a lot of blame. Eileen, actually, there's a lot of controversy over her, too, because she's not said whether she had to give up her American citizenship. And so people are kind of speculating that if she did admit that she didn't have to give it up, that's bad in terms of the Chinese internet. They would trash her and trash the government for making an exception, because there's a lot of, you're not supposed to have dual citizenship in China, but a lot of rich Chinese people have passports from other countries. And what they do is they essentially never inform the Chinese government that they never surrender their Chinese passport. So then they can travel back and forth, and they have, maybe a Canadian passport or an American passport and things like that. So there's a lot of resentment already at people who live such a privileged life that they're able to do that, when for most people it's so hard to get a passport, even a Chinese passport. It's so hard to get a visa to go to another country.
Yeah. And so that's why there is the debate about it being a class issue with Eileen Gu. There was also, she made a very stupid comment about VPNs, because there's been all this debate about, like, China doesn't have a free and open internet. Olympic athletes have been restricted since there's apparently little to no internet there.
Yeah, they promised that there was going to be an open internet, but then apparently there were a lot of websites that are still blocked, even in the Olympic Village.
Do you think our Olympic fans
are able to watch China Uncensored?
Yeah. I had a little tickle in my throat and that kind of interrupted the flow of my joke.
You want to start again?
No, this is reality. That's the problem with the media landscape today. You never see anyone cough or sneeze. It's not real. People need to understand that we're humans too, that we're all humans together.
That's beautiful, Chris.
This is why I'm beautiful inside and out. Seriously, wait till you see that Victoria's Secret spread.
I can wait.
Oh, God. Okay. I think I'm seeing it in my head, which is unfortunate for me.
Yeah, it's a new technology they have. It's not a physical copy. It's just broadcast directly into, okay.
Like meditation on, what was it? Or like chakras on, you had
Unblocked.
Unblocked,
I think
yes.
that was Matt, actually, who had that.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's great. I'll take credit for it.
Okay. One of us is brilliant.
Yeah. But so Eileen Gu said, she was posting, about the Olympics on Instagram, and then a Chinese person was like, well, you can post about this, but, millions of people in China can't access the Instagram or whatever. And then she's like, well, they can just get a VPN on the App Store. It's, it's free.
Meanwhile, Chinese activists have been arrested for using VPNs.
Yeah, some people have been arrested for providing VPNs.
Yeah.
And the App Store has taken down some VPNs too, I believe.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that, because after she made that comment and it kind of spread on the Chinese internet, people were commenting like, you can get a VPN on the App Store. I haven't seen any VPNs on the Chinese App Store.
Yeah, it was a very much a let them eat cake kind of moment.
Yeah, it actually became a meme, which is pretty funny.
Oh, yeah?
Because what she said is, it's literally free on the App Store. So people just started putting other things in there. Like, anyone can have dual citizenship. It's literally free on the App Store.
I see.
Or anyone can have a Beijing residence permit. It's literally free on the App Store. Just like all these things that ordinary Chinese people cannot get.
Yeah. And so Eileen Gu is getting a lot of criticism in the U.S. for being a traitor or, winning gold for a horrible communist regime that's committing genocide. Then there's getting pressure in the Chinese internet for obviously being a different class of people. And, I just kind of feel bad for her mostly. I'm under the impression that she has no real idea what is going on. She's apparently got this really overbearing tiger mom. You might know something about that, Shelley. And yeah, I think she's been thrust into a position that she was not really prepared for or aware of. I kind of feel bad for her. I mean, maybe I'm just, being too warm and compassionate that, she did know what she did and she just didn't care. But
I mean, I think there can definitely be a lot of denial. We know people who grew up in China and didn't know about a lot of the things like Tiananmen Square that were happening, right? And then you have this moment of kind of realizing what the place you considered your, motherland has done.
Yeah.
I mean, she grew up in America.
Yeah, so it's not
But a lot of Americans don't know what's happening in China. And I can understand there's this feeling like, oh, well, I ancestrally belong. She called China her homeland. And I understand that, on a emotional level, and not just because the Chinese government is pushing that kind of stuff for propaganda reasons, which they definitely do. But, you do feel connected to a place. I remember, because I left China when I was very young, when the first time I went back to China when I was a teenager, it felt like, oh, it doesn't feel like being in America. It feels like totally different. And
just come home.
It's like the way I feel about Northern California.
It's like the way I feel about Cracker Barrel.
Well, anyway, so I can understand the feeling, right? And I remember cheering for China in the Olympics when I was a kid, before I kind of understood all of the terrible human rights things that happened. Because guess what my parents never told me about? Like the Cultural Revolution that they went through. Like there's a lot of kind of wanting to shield the younger generation from the bad stuff. So I can understand the feeling, but she is put in a position now where she is essentially covering for the Chinese regime in a lot of ways. Like when Peng Shuai came and watched her win the gold medal at the Olympics, somebody asked her, like a reporter asked her about Peng Shuai. And then she was like, oh, yeah, like it was just really great to see her happy and healthy and like out here doing her thing.
Being controlled by the Chinese Communist Party?
Yeah. And maybe she doesn't know what's happening to Peng Shuai or doesn't really, or believes, the IOC when they say that, like, nothing's wrong with her. She's totally fine, while the government minders are watching her every move.
And you can see them in the mirror.
But yeah, so I don't know. It could be ignorance. It could be denial. It could just be that she doesn't care. Yeah.
Well, yeah, regardless, like she is now in the history books of, winning an American, competing for China to win a gold in the genocide Olympics.
Yeah, and I think that's it, right? If she was just competing for like another country that wasn't committing genocide, she would not be getting a lot of these questions.
Yeah, like she's going to be an example of like the blindness people had to the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, and she's not the only example. Like if you ask me, like Ray Dalio is a much better example, or Larry Fink, or people who are continually for decades pumping money into the Chinese regime. But
and I would argue that Ray Dalio and Larry Fink, they're in a position to know much better, right?
Yeah.
Than like, a teenager who is, Eileen Gu is like about 18 or
she's
something.
She's 18. Right? She's been going to China and kind of having a very privileged life in China since
she was standing next to Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, of course, that's one element of it, right? Which is that there's a China that the Communist Party wants you to see, and especially what they, the way they treat the elite. It's kind of rolling out the red carpet, nice hotels, top-tier cities, all that stuff. And while only a fraction of 1% of Chinese citizens live that lifestyle, that is what people see when they go to China, especially the more, like journalists, congressmen, wealthy investors, business people are all getting that like top 1% type tour. And so like I understand on one hand, like it's easy to fool people with that. And if Ray Dalio can be fooled, like an 18-year-old can certainly be fooled. But I think it'll be really interesting to look back. Like I would want to interview her 10 years from now and just be like, looking back, how do you feel about this? I mean, she may not want to answer that question, but like I think that the perspective will change.
Yeah. And I think we're in the middle of when she decided to switch to China in 2019. It
was pre-COVID.
It was pre-COVID. It was pre most of the Hong Kong stuff. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think that people's perception of the Chinese Communist Party has changed a lot in the last 2 years. Yeah. 3 years now. Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's probably part of it. Of course, we already knew what was happening in Xinjiang to the Uyghurs, right? Like that had already been reported, but it didn't get as much mainstream traction.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, it's I think a bad situation all around. And like an awkward thing also is that Eileen Gu is probably getting a lot of attention, partially also because she's biracial.
Mm-hmm.
And like in China, there's still kind of like a lot of places. This might be changing now because Xi Jinping is doing this whole like we shouldn't be like looking to the West and Western culture, etc. But for a long time, like like models, they would want like Western models rather than Chinese models. They would want like there was like a prestige in Chinese advertising and things like that attached to things from the West. That like remember there's a Chinese mattress company that hired some random like old white guy to be the face of their mattress company. I forget the name of the mattress company right now, but they wanted it to look like an Italian mattress company. It's a Chinese mattress company. And it became famous all over China and Hong Kong because you would constantly see this guy's face everywhere and no one knew who he was.
Did we see that when we were in Hong Kong?
We saw that. He's like kind of like an emaciated looking.
I remember that.
Like with glasses and looks really creepy. I think that's also part of it, that everybody's like, who's this guy?
Yeah, I remember Alan, our photography guy, making jokes about him being like the bed Nazi.
Yeah, so we'll put up photos like this guy. And the Wall Street Journal recently did an investigation to look into who this guy was. Yeah, it was some random Western guy who had been living in China in the 90s, I think, and had done like a photo shoot for.
Wow.
Yeah, and then like he became famous all over China. He passed away a few years ago, so I don't know that I don't know if he knew about his fame, but like it's kind of like a crazy thing. So Eileen Gu being beautiful, just like you, Chris.
Yes, thank you. You didn't need to say it because it's known, but thank you.
Yeah, and like biracial, like she has like, so she's exotic to Chinese people, which is kind of in the way that a lot of people see like Asians as exotic in America. Like being half white makes you exotic in China. So there's like a lot of other stuff kind of coming into this whole situation.
Yeah, well, because the Chinese Communist Party has definitely encouraged Chinese people to be ultra-nationalistic, suspicious of outsiders. So there is a whole racial dimension to this.
And I think that's why a lot of this, having a lot of like Western faces and advertising and stuff like that, that's going to be not okay pretty soon if it isn't already changed. But that's the way it was in China for a long time. That mattress company stopped using that guy.
Oh, that's so sad. The bed Nazi.
It's weird, those ads that are like around for years and years. Like, remember the Dr. Zismore ads in the New York subway?
Yeah, that is like I think you'd have to be in New York before 2010 or 2012 to have seen them.
Wait, really? Oh, wow. I've spent way too much of my life in New York City.
In the subways. Well, so here's an interesting thing that has also come out on the topic of like these Westerners selling out to China. Bloomberg just came out with a piece about why we should support China's zero COVID policy. And like, this is stunning. This came out recently. This wasn't like something that they dropped like a year and a half ago. This was in the past couple of days.
Yeah, and the reason they said it was kind of transparently selfish in a way, right? Because it was like, well, if we want to not have more supply chain issues and delays and things coming from China, then we should support the zero COVID policy because China's going to have such a hard time opening up because their vaccines aren't as good, et cetera.
Well, it was also like a takedown of the whole idea of lockdowns, that like, as soon as they're out of lockdowns, the virus is going to spread like crazy, and then supply chains will shut down.
What do you mean it's a takedown of lockdown? Isn't that saying lockdowns work?
Well, no, not long term. It's
right.
like saying that, like, yeah, we all know that, like, this isn't a solution. As soon as we come out of lockdown, it's going to spread anyways, and that's not something you're supposed to say.
Well, I think that that's definitely something that the Chinese Communist Party has not talked about, is that like how they're going to get out of zero COVID. Like, it's pretty much like, we're going to be in zero COVID forever because we're going to stamp it out with zero COVID.
Mm-hmm. Everyone will get to keep that health tracking app that we talked about in that episode where, if for some reason you want to travel somewhere and you're Chinese dissident, your health code goes from green to red.
And to be clear, it's not a vaccine passport. It's not even a contact tracing app, because the point of this app is actually to track your movements all the time and to control where you can go. So it's not a contact tracing app that like lets people know, or lets you know if you've been somewhere and you might be like exposed to COVID, right? It's actually just like if you have a yellow or red thing, you can't go anywhere.
Which is also why it's so creepy that Bloomberg is like, yeah, this zero COVID policy, we should support it. It's like we should support their authoritarianism.
For them, because it makes the rest of our lives better. Like, it was just mind-blowingly terrible.
It's basically like saying, I love slave labor in foreign countries because that makes my products slightly cheaper.
Yeah.
Right. And like, I'm glad it's happening there. Obviously, we wouldn't want it in America because that's wrong. But like in like Vietnam, whatever, like that's fine. It's the same thing. And I guess I don't understand how people can have that disconnect where like it's wrong to treat people a certain way here in America, but it's okay to treat them badly if they're somewhere else. Like, how does that work? Like, you know, aren't these people supposed to be citizens of the world?
I mean, I think that people would say, well, it's bad to have slave labor there, but there's nothing we can do about it.
But there's lots of things we can do about it.
Like stop buying stuff made in China?
Yeah.
I mean, you'd think that this would be if you're worried about continued supply chain issues, and like that might be a sign that maybe it's time to diversify your supply chain.
I think it is. I think it's time.
So Bloomberg, you know, releases this article that could basically have been written by the People's Daily.
Oh, yes, and that's right. I know where this is going.
And then the People's Daily publishes an article called "World Should Support China's Zero COVID Policy, Bloomberg." And it was basically just 4 paragraphs of exact lifting of the Bloomberg article.
Which is often how Chinese state-run social media works. They get foreign press to say something in line with party propaganda, and then party propaganda says, hey, they said it.
We didn't say it. They said Bloomberg said it. And
what was circle of life.
And what was funny is that like every paragraph in this article it was probably the easiest article this propaganda worker ever had to write, right? Mm-hmm. Which was just like literally pulling paragraphs from the Bloomberg article, ignoring the ones where they talked about China has a problem, and just saying like how great the zero COVID policy is, and then just adding the report says at the end of every paragraph.
Because of the closed internet, nobody reading the People's Daily article is going to be able to get to the original article.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think they would, but
VPNs are free.
You know, they're literally free. But the funny thing is they forgot to do it a couple times. So they just literally put the exact same paragraph that was in, like copy pasted the exact same paragraph in the Bloomberg article as part of the People's Daily article. It was pretty beautiful to watch that happen. And I was like, the circle of propaganda, the loop has closed.
Bloomberg. For the media company started by the man who said Xi Jinping is not a dictator.
Well, Bloomberg also got in trouble about 10 years ago for actually censoring their own reporting.
On China.
Yeah. They killed a story by one of their reporters because they were afraid it was going to get them into trouble with the Chinese leadership.
Yeah. You actually asked him directly about that.
I was at a press conference. It was an unrelated press conference, and I was there, and I asked Michael Bloomberg, who was then, you know, the mayor of New York City, and I asked him about that. And then he basically tried to flip it on me and accused me of like making stuff up and like all these things. Like I felt personally attacked. And I was like, this is a really interesting response to my question.
Yeah.
How did he try to attack you?
It was like almost 10 years ago.
Well, I remember he was like, you know, and it's I've divested any control over Bloomberg News, and you should get your facts right.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of like that thing. He didn't be like, oh, you know, you look like a monkey. It wasn't like that kind of attack. It was just, like accusing me of being a bad reporter or that kind of thing. And yes, like as mayor, Michael Bloomberg had to technically divest himself of his corporate positions, right? So you can't be a mayor and actively run a news site. But the reality is that you never fully can divest, right? And this is, interestingly, this is the same argument that people used to attack Trump, which is that like you can say, oh, as president, you're technically divested from, you know, the Trump organization or whatever, right? He's not actively running hotels and brands and all those things. Right. But they're like, oh, but it still has your name. So you still like at some level have control over it because you hired the people and all that stuff and you're responsible. And I think there's some truth to that argument. And there's also some truth to that argument with Michael Bloomberg. So like, yeah, you know, you're responsible for the news organization you created. And, in Michael Bloomberg's case, it was probably clear that after his third term as mayor, he would go back to having, some position where he's actively running things again. So I don't think it's fair for him to say he's totally blameless for what his organization does. And on top of that, all the top management of his organization understand that while Bloomberg Media is technically separate from Bloomberg LP that does the terminals, those are the investment terminals, and that's like their main source of money, right? Providing real-time stock and other financial data, right? Like their big business model relies on having those terminals sold in China and getting access to real-time data from the Chinese markets, right? That's part of their global business, and that's the main way that the company makes their money. And so the media company that's tied to Bloomberg understands that there is this relationship, and getting kicked out of China would mean not just the news getting kicked out of China, but potentially everything getting kicked out of China.
I mean, that's the reason that they killed the story, right?
Right. Well, no, Bloomberg is afraid of getting kicked out of China, period. Also, they killed a story that was critical of Chinese leaders. There's two dots.
It's not my job to connect them.
It is not, yeah.
Well, I think those dots are a lot closer than the other dots.
Yeah, well, in this case, Michael Bloomberg accused me of getting my facts wrong for connecting the dots that should not have been connected in his view.
He really hurt you, didn't he?
He did. He hurt my feelings. I'm very sensitive. I have a very fragile ego. It's very large, but also very fragile. It's a tough life being me.
Speaking of glass, let's talk about Dwen Dwen.
I don't want to talk about that horrible panda monster.
When I first saw that mascot, I was like, what is this thing?
Yeah, nobody really liked him when he was debuted a few years ago as the official Olympic mascot. And he looks like a panda bear who's kind of encased in, it's been called an ice suit, and then they started saying it was a space suit because he was a panda from the future of winter sports coming.
Well, why would he be from space?
Look, this whole thing is very unclear.
No, he's from China, but he represented space in the future Olympics. He gave up his citizenship for a space citizenship.
Oh,
okay. Well,
I compete for space in the Olympics.
Well, there we go.
I like that.
Well, pretty soon that's just going to be competing for China.
But yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah, China's making all kinds of space plans.
Yep. Anyway, so Dwen Dwen is this like panda mascot, right? And people called him ugly, and
which made me so happy that people recognize how hideous pandas are.
They called him things like a flash frozen panda or a sesame ball with its filling leaking out.
Beautiful.
This is according to a Washington Post story. Like we talked about this in last week's headlines episode about how there's been a sudden run on Dwen Dwen where like he was really unpopular, and now there's like a huge Dwen Dwen craze where people like all of the products featuring him are selling out all the time, and then police started arresting people for trying to resell products at like a 300% markup or something like that. It was just
supply and demand.
But why is Dwen Dwen suddenly so popular? Have people's artistic tastes fallen so far in like 2 years that something that was ugly in 2020 is now considered beautiful? Like that doesn't make any sense.
Well,
this Washington Post article is talking about how like the hype could be being boosted by Chinese state-run media, essentially, because they keep kind of pushing Dwen Dwen. And the Olympics are too. Like on the Olympics Twitter account, there's a video of Dwen Dwen getting stuck in the door of one of the Olympic venues.
Oh yeah,
and how cute is this, etc.
Not cute at all.
But what's also interesting is that according to an analysis by the Sydney Morning Herald, almost 20% of accounts posting on Twitter about Dwen Dwen were created in the last month. Which makes it sound like one of those kind of inauthentic, coordinated campaigns, like the whole hashtag thing that they were trying to do with the genocide games.
No, a lot of people, when they create Twitter accounts, use a profile picture from Shutterstock.
And they have no followers, and they don't follow anyone.
I know
they
what the
post about being Dwen Dwen all the time.
I know what the Bing Dwen Dwen suit is. It's one of those guys from Among Us because he's so sus.
Oh, well, what I thought is that it kind of looks like PPE in a weird way. Like it reminds me of the people wearing the full suit PPE everywhere in the Olympics.
But of course, the mascot was created before the pandemic.
Yeah, so it's not supposed to be, but it kind of reminds me of that.
Just prescient.
But they were was it called hashtag bombing? The genocide games hashtag a while ago, where these researchers from Clemson University did a study where they looked at hundreds of thousands of tweets that were talking about the genocide games, and a lot of them prior to January of this year had nothing to do with the Olympics. It was just random stuff in an effort to kind of dilute the hashtag genocide games that activists were trying to use to bring attention to the genocide games.
This was
Beijing.
A while ago because now if you
it's
look
cleaned
at it,
up. Yeah. So Twitter basically deleted a bunch of the accounts that were doing that. They've cleaned it up. So now if you look at the hashtag genocide games, it's mostly people talking about the genocide games. But, from like 6 months last year, before most people would have been talking about it, most of the tweets were just random stuff created by obviously bots and inauthentic accounts in an effort to change the conversation about the Olympics.
It's interesting because that's all the dystopian movies about how the future of robots and AI would screw us. This is not a way anyone thought about how people would be using robots.
I mean, it's less exciting than watching, a robot war, right?
That's true.
Watching people fight on Twitter.
Speaking of, I just watched Johnny Mnemonic for the first time. Highly recommend it. It is fantastic.
I remember the plot is something like he's carrying some kind of data in his head, but it's like a few terabytes or something, right?
It's not even a terabyte. It's 700 or 800 gigs. And he's like a walking USB stick.
Yeah.
Okay, I've never seen Johnny Mnemonic.
It's fantastic. It takes place in the future of 2021.
Oh.
Corporations run the world.
Uh-huh.
There's a global pandemic. And the InfoWars are in full swing as different factions try to control the narrative.
They're right about everything except that people carry USBs in their heads.
No, we carry, yeah.
But I mean, we carry, the equivalent of that with us, everywhere we go.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. It's so stylized and so cool.
And that's Keanu Reeves, right?
Keanu Reeves, yeah. It was interesting. He did a movie about earlier in the 90s when people had no idea what the internet was and got it totally wrong. And then he was in The Matrix where people finally nailed that story of this is what computer technology could be like. There's a great scene where he puts a virtual reality helmet on and he's in the internet controlling things.
Is that the metaverse?
Basically.
Wow.
Well, I think that about wraps it up for us today on this episode of China Unscripted. Don't you guys agree?
Can we end it on a positive note?
Johnny Mnemonic. All right, if you can think of something more positive.
Maybe I can't. We're going to talk about zero COVID.
And now we end on your defeat.
That's a positive note.
That's a positive for me and Chris.
No, I think it's a sign of the times that we can't find something positive.
Oh, I actually can find something positive. But this goes all the way back to the Eileen Gu thing, which is something you said about Nathan Chen, where you're well, isn't that normal that a Chinese American skates or an American citizen skates for America? It's actually pretty unique in a certain sense because, America is really probably the only country in the world where you can come and become an American so quickly. I mean, there's still a lot of difficulties with getting American citizenship for a lot of people, but I'm thinking about culturally, you can become American, your family can become American in a generation. And that's not something that exists in a lot of the world. And I think that, if Americans who haven't really traveled or lived in other places may not kind of realize how unique this is.
So, like, you're an American, but Matt could never go to China and be Chinese.
No. I mean, even somebody like Da Shan, right, the Canadian guy who went to China in the 80s and has lived in China for so long.
And speaks just flawless Mandarin.
He's always going to be like
a foreigner, Lao-Wai.
Yeah, he's always going to be a Lao-Wai. But not just China, though. That's not unique to China. I remember years ago traveling to Italy to visit a friend who was living there. And we were hanging out with some Italian guys, and she had to explain to them why I was American. She didn't even want to confuse them by telling them that I was born in China. So she kind of made it like Shelley's parents were from China and she was born in America. Mm-hmm. So that's what makes her American. Because, you know, Chinese people, there are a lot of Chinese people, Chinese immigrants in Italy. They will never be Italian in that way. I mean, they could maybe eventually if the culture changes, but, you know, I don't know.
So yeah, but I mean, also like, you know, the European countries and Asian countries generally don't do birthright citizenship either, right? Like that's a Western Hemisphere thing anyway.
Yeah.
Right. And America is kind of at the forefront of that. And you know, Canada has it, I believe, as well. Like, but like we
have birthright citizenship to the point that if you are born in airspace over America, you are an American citizen.
Wow. That's beautiful. What if you're just born in regular space, like the future Panda?
Like if you were born in a space station that happened to be circling America at that moment.
That actually will have to become something that's discussed at some point in the future. Like where is the cutoff? Is there a cutoff?
Are you a space citizen? Are you an American? Do people have...
I consider myself a citizen of space. Well, that was a nice positive note to end on. It was basically that America is great, right?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. America is the best.
Thanks for watching China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Jha.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
We'll talk to you next time.